Thank you, Mr. President. First, despite some of the very sharp disagreements we have on a few policy provisions, I'd like to say a warm word about how I thought the committee was conducted in a very open manner, giving a lot of opportunity for discussion, and further discussion was prompted. I thought the chair handled that fabulously, and I really appreciate each member on both sides of the aisle on that committee, because there was a lot of real thoughtful discussion that I think for the most part, was concerned about how do we make a better higher education system. And I think there's some ideological disagreements there about how funding works and what our responsibilities are and maybe what it looks like. But I really did appreciate a fairly robust committee and robust discussion, and I thought was really thoughtful and hopefully, kind of how I hoped this place would work most of the time. So I appreciate that, and my hat's off to Senator Anderson for that. I want to create a little bit of connective tissue, and I want us to think a little bit about when the average person's watching this or learning about it or reading about it, how does what we do here actually result in things that occur on the ground? Are we done? Good. The connective tissue is this. How our actions here and when we pass bills and we suggest policy changes and we set targets has a real impact that goes several ripple effects away. And if we want to think about what are we doing here today that might have, as Senator Little suggested, an effect on our kids and their kids, I'd like to take you back 50 years from now and have a discussion of what happened with my parents that led to this moment in many ways. In 1966, my dad enrolled in Morehead State College at the time, and in 1968, my mom enrolled in Morehead State College. Now, the previous year, Governor Rolog, Senate Majority Leader John Swack, and Speaker Lloyd Duxbury really proposed a budget that continued a long tradition of investing in higher education, investing in Minnesota's well-being, investing in our future. I want to thank those folks back then for having the foresight and the investment. And I want to thank the taxpayers going back to statehood who saw higher education in K-12, now E-12 education as being an important priority, because it was an investment. It was an investment in our state, and it was an investment in our future. The story that I think fits with my family is kind of a classic story I think a lot of families in Minnesota have. My dad moved off the farm as his father had passed away, and his brother took over the farm, and he was the first person to kind of move to the city, and he went to college, much to, if he's embarrassed that I tell you this, but he was chasing a girl from his hometown at the time, and followed her to the school and went to college. And my mom was a transplant from California to Barrett, Minnesota, where my dad and my mom met. And she followed him after they met and hung out and started dating, and went to Morehead State University just a few years later. The reality is that time they took there and the degree they got were some of the very first, on my dad's side, the absolute first higher education degree. Norwegian immigrants that had emigrated 2 generations before, that moved into the state, that had just looking for some land and an opportunity to feed their family and maybe make a little bit of money and have some prosperity, culminated in the next step of that dream where one of their kids went on to college and got a degree. My dad had a long career in manufacturing, farm implement machinery, that kind of stuff. My mom has worked in health systems for years, became the first person in our family to have an advanced degree. Their experience, the investment made by Minnesotans years ago, culminated in an opportunity for my parents, not unlike many Minnesotans at that time, coming off of a more rural situation, getting a chance, an opportunity to go on and have a higher education, have greater opportunity. It's undoubted that part of my career today, not only as someone with an advanced degree, but as a college professor and even a state senator, is in part due to the decisions they made back in '66, which were in part due to the decisions made by taxpayers and politicians generations before that. Just 3 generations ago, my family was just farmers and trappers. That's all they did. Some of my family lived on the back corner of the farm lot, and all they did was trap for a living. And now, 3 generations later, my family gets to be business owners. in parts of small towns in Minnesota. They get to be, like myself, college professors. My dad gets to be retired and can enjoy a modest life as a retired person. My mom continues to work and is a consultant working in healthcare leadership. We're blessed with that opportunity because Minnesota and the people of Minnesota made that investment. And just because, much like my family was able to do, many families were able to take advantage of that. That's what investing in higher education does for Minnesota. It creates that kind of opportunity. And at the risk of sounding cheesy, I talk about this in my intercultural class. I'm not big on the American exceptionalism. I'm not sure that's the direction it's a good place to head, but I will tell you there's one area where I think America is quite exceptional. Really the first country, government on the planet that said, you know what, you have the right not only to life and liberty, but you have the right to pursue happiness, whatever that means to you. And I think the investment Minnesota makes is right in line with that concept. So what does that mean when we look past our state? What does that mean when we look and compare ourselves to other states? Now, I'm sure, much to your chagrin, you can't forget the speech I gave a couple of years ago talking about how Minnesota, I'm big on Minnesota exceptionalism, let's be clear about that, and how great Minnesota is. Back then, I quoted a U.S. News and World Report that had 60 rubrics that judged the states, and we were in the top 5. Well, they came out with another report, folks, and now it's 75 rubrics, and we're number 2, behind Iowa, which I think is embarrassing, but we'll get to that another time. 75 measures, and we're number 2, ranking really high in almost every rubric they could come up with. That's not an accident. That's a function of a state that made a solid commitment to investing in itself, period. That's what's important. That's why I think I'm so passionate about higher education, because nothing sets us up more for the future than people who have a place to live that's good, an environment that's solid that they can live in that's safe, and an opportunity to better themselves. Whether it's going to be an HVAC technician, it's going to be a welder, a philosopher, a lawyer, a doctor. Those opportunities are there. And here's the deal. They're there for a price that they can afford. The tuition rate back in 1966 was astoundingly low, but then again, it didn't cost as much to live. We've got to make sure we understand that. And so half of the argument my friends across the aisle make, I think it really resonates with me. I do think that there should be a benefit that helps people go to school so it's affordable, that only benefits us, that only raises our tax base, that only raises the standard of living for our constituents, that makes them more aware, more active participants, and more active citizens in our society. That's important. So why do I tell this story? Because unfortunately, this particular bill continues a recent tradition we have of setting back higher education. It just doesn't do what we need it to do. Now, I don't think it's because Chair Anderson had this decision to set back higher education. I think he did the best he could with what he had within the confines of what his caucus handed him. I really believe that. I think he did the best he could with what he had. Unfortunately, and I think that I've said this before, but I want to be clear, that shortcoming isn't necessarily a partisan shortcoming. Because not that long ago we were in charge, and I don't feel like we did as much more as we could have done either. We didn't do as much as we could have done either. The problem we have is that this bill punishes the students in the short run, and ultimately, based on how I explained it a few seconds ago, punishes the state in the long run. And that's the problem. It's short-sighted. Not supporting our schools where we need to can become short-sighted for us in the long run in the health of our state. I want to walk you through a few parts of the bill that really illustrate this for me. The $100 million in additional funding is a bit, well, it's accurate and it's not. Is it $100 million more than we spent last time? Yes. But I've used this example, and I'm going to continue using it because it's such a great way to explain this. If a pencil in 2018 cost 10 cents and a pencil in 2020 costs 12 cents, and we give you 11 cents to buy that pencil, two things are true. One, we did give you more money to buy the pencil. Two, we cut your buying power. Those two things are true. They don't seem like they could be true, but they are. And so we have to ask ourselves some questions. This particular budget, with $100 million additional funding, based on the most conservative estimate of inflation, falls short about $23 million just to match inflation, on the most conservative estimate. And you're right, we should try to figure out why is inflation for higher education so much higher than regular inflation. I think that's an important thing we should look at. This budget is a continuation of the disinvestment in higher education that we've been seeing for years, going back to the 60s in terms of a percentage of the whole budget, going back to the 90s in terms of really flipping the student to tuition ratio. Now, I will say, to our credit, there is a little bit of ray of sunshine that we bought back and got some of that min-state tuition back. We're not quite where we need to be, but we're getting there, and that's a nice start. Let's start with the state grant program. We increased the state grant program in this bill by, I could have the numbers wrong, but I think it's $23 million. What that will do as effect is it will create, it's more than 20? Yeah, $23 million, right. It will create so there's more money going to the student per semester through the state grant program. And while on its face that sounds nice, but you can't consider that in a vacuum. You have to put it against what the tuition costs will be, right? And if we don't fund at the level we need to, tuition costs will outpace the amount gained from the state grant program. It's like a snake eating its own tail. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. If we're going to invest money, we should invest money in the schools to keep tuition low. And this tuition control thing is well intended. Again, like I said, I don't necessarily disagree that the tuition is something we want to freeze. We do. We want to freeze. We want to lower it if we can. But when we do it by sacrificing other parts of the school, sacrificing other parts of the academic experience, sacrificing our priorities in education, that doesn't help. Remember how I said we're ranked in the top? Education is one of those areas. We continue to cut at the bone and the meat of education, we're not going to be ranked that high there anymore. We're not going to have an engaged citizenry. We're not going to have higher voter turnout. We're not going to have more civic engagement. We're not going to have a place Fortune 500 companies want to do business. So we've got to be really thought about that. You know, we had some students that came when the bill was offered to freeze tuition completely. And those students gave very compelling stories. I was moved by them. I thought they were really important. Stories about how they're barely able to make it through to college. And if we raise tuition, that might just be the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think that's compelling. The problem is that in that conversation, it was implied, in my opinion, that the problem was the university system and the tuition, like they were the villains in this scenario. I think Senator Latz made that very clear. They're not. Or at least not entirely. That we have a certain responsibility here too. We can't freeze tuition if we're also going to cut the quality of our educational system. We have to find a balance to that. We have to re-engage in our responsibilities there. Now, by the time it came to the floor, to the credit of the chair, he changed the language to 2% and 1%, 2% in the first year cap of tuition increase and 1% in the second year. I think that's a compromise moving in the right direction, and I really sincerely appreciate that. I hope in conference committee we can find something that works that doesn't harm the schools while also helping the students. I want to find that sweet spot. I think that's important. If we short fund higher education, we are just simply short funding our future. That's just the reality we're living in. If we short fund higher education, we're short funding our future. Now, there's no doubt, and I don't deny the fact that I'm a bit of a homer for higher education because that's the business I live in, the business I work in. But I didn't pick that trade because I was trying to make money. Nobody gets rich in higher education, at least not as a faculty. I chose that because it's an opportunity to make the world a better place, and somebody long ago gave me that opportunity by empowering me when I was not a good student. And that's now my burden and responsibility to take to all the students that I find, especially in the community college level, where they come back unsure about their skills, unsure about whether they should be there, unsure if they can survive or succeed in this environment. And my job is to get them so they do. So when I say we short fund higher education, we're short funding that moment that helps those students find their way, whether it's just going to be a 2-year degree, going on to a 4-year degree, or they want to go on to be a doctor. We have to be really mindful about that. And when I believe that the party on the other side of the aisle, my friends across the aisle, are ready to have that discussion, I will embrace it in open arms. And you know what? Maybe there is reason to cut when that happens. Maybe we'll uncover things that shows there's some problems we got to fix. I want to do that. But the motive has got to be keeping that education system strong, because it keeps our economy strong and it keeps the state strong. And for that reason, I can't support the bill in its current form. I hope that we see it in conference committee. I do believe that my friends across the aisle on this committee are walking in with the best of intentions, and I really look forward to seeing what comes out of conference, and really look forward to hopefully voting for a bill that we can all get behind. That sure, there'll be parts I don't like, there'll be parts they don't like, but we find some middle ground that makes it better. That's the goal. Are we making the system better with our bill? Right now we're not. I hope that we get there. Thank you for your time.